Hey there, friend. Welcome back to the Doing What Matters podcast. I am so glad that you showed up this week because this episode is just such a great episode. You are going to want to lean in, learn, and linger with my friend Kim Avery. Kim is going to share with us just the journey that she's been on for the past couple of years. But let me give you just a little bit of backstory so you can connect some of the dots in Kim's story as she really embodies this idea of living from rest, not rush, that we talk about here on the podcast. So, backstory is this. 20 years ago, Kim moved from being a professional counselor to being a professional life and business coach. She loved every minute of it, and she thought that was what she would do for the rest of her life. But over the past 2 years, God has been calling her to radically reorder her life and her priorities and the way that she serves in the world. So now, as an author, as a podcaster, and as a spiritual director, she helps Christ followers flourish in every area of their life so they can serve from a full cup. So you're already hearing just some of the shifts that Kim has made in the past couple of years. And the beauty of this conversation is we're going to go a little bit more behind the scenes and see just what was going on for Kim, how her and God walked this journey together and are still walking this journey together as she kind of reorders and realigns her life in where she feels like God is calling her and that God is speaking into her life in these ways. So I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. But while you're listening in, I want you to think about your own story. And maybe that sitting still, being quiet, and listening to what does God have for you? What is He inviting you to? Are you feeling a shift? Are you feeling a change? And a tool that we have here at the Real Life Process is over on our sister website, onelifemaps.com. And one of the maps that I think could be hugely impactful as you begin this journey of listening to God, much like you'll hear Kim talk about, is that very first map, My Life Now. That very first map just invites you to some great questions. So after you listen to this interview, this conversation between a couple of friends that Kim and I are going to have, you may be wondering, I wonder if I sat with God around some things, what would be the lingering question He would have for me? And that's exactly where that first map takes you in the One Life Maps series. So we'll have that in the show notes, but it's super easy. onelifemaps.com would be my invitation to you to go and download that very first map. And without further ado, let's dive in, my friend, into this great conversation with my dear friend, Kim Avery. So, Kim Avery, it is so great to be with you, my friend. I've been looking forward to finally getting you back on the podcast. So, welcome in.
Thank you. I feel like this is going to be the conversation we would have side by side in two rocking chairs if we were up in the mountains. And so it's fun to invite other people into that conversation.
Yes, as you're listening in today, Kim and I have known each other for a while now. So it does feel like kind of old friends. Let's get in the rocking chairs, time together. But yet, I want to have a really purposeful conversation about just some journey that you've been on in the past year or so. And I've got to kind of have a sideline seat to some of those things. But um let's just dive in if you're okay with that as
All right.
to some of those things. So I want to go back just maybe a year or two in this journey and just kind of share with us where you were a couple of years ago. You were a coach. You've been coaching for a long time. You can go back a little further than that if you'd like to, and just how you even got to there. But just kind of take us back to where you were, say 2020, 21. 22, somewhere in there, and kind of what was going on for Kim Avery at that time.
Sure. Well, the pandemic's always a good touch point that we can all experience as a time. And so, leading up into the pandemic, I came from a background as a professional counselor.
Mhm.
Then I discovered the amazing world of life coaching and business coaching and just dove in headlong and probably had done that for about 15 years and literally thought I would do it for the rest of my life. I really, truly enjoyed it. And then 2020 happened, and we don't need to dive too deep into that because everybody's walked through those troubled waters together. But the interesting thing that was happening for me, especially as I was doing a lot of business coaching at the time, is that the clients that I was coaching who were entrepreneurs and or ministry leaders would start coming to the calls and say, I know I should, and I'll put that in air quotes, be talking about my business, be talking about growing the ministry. But personally, I'm just so burnt out, stressed, overwhelmed, confused, family issues, whatever it was. And life kept intruding, right, on people's business plans and the things that they knew that God had for them, but they couldn't even really give attention to them because of everything that was going on in the world. And more, I realized that these are the conversations, right? The conversations around being before we get to the doing that I was actually really enjoying. So I thought, okay, Jesus, this is good. We'll just have both of these conversations together as people show up to the call. And as usual, God had something entirely different in mind. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, Teresa.
Yes, I hear you. And that being doing space is something that, we talk about often here on the podcast, that I talk about often. And I love how, as you were in that journey, that you kind of felt led to, at a crossroads, go, okay, God is, moving me to one side of this or the other. Remind me again, as an author of a book, where did the book fall in that timeline?
Mhm.
Because the Prayer Powered Entrepreneur book, what year did that one come out?
That launched 4 weeks before the global pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Which is
Okay.
just isn't God's timing funny? Because in some ways it's like, wow, all this work, and then who in the world is paying attention to a book launch? But God has been so gracious. It was actually the perfect time and a lot of awareness in the world around
Mhm.
people running their business in a prayer powered way. And so that's been a real blessing. What was interesting is when we had the lockdowns all over the United States, even here in the state of Florida, where I live for a while. What I remember most is we have like a mile long loop around my neighborhood. And I would walk around my neighborhood and say, Lord, the world's in a crisis. People are in a crisis. Churches are in a crisis. What do you want me to do? And I probably wore an inch lower in the concrete around my neighborhood as Jesus and I paced, because what else did we do during the lockdowns but walk around and around that loop? And it was so surprising to me to hear God say, take everything you're doing and be done with it. I'm like, no, 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 no. This is
Mm.
a both and situation, Lord. I get to keep business coaching. I get to keep being vice president of marketing at Professional Christian Coaching Institute. I get to keep the clients I have, and I would love to help them more with their being and their pacing and their timing and their relationship with the Lord. And it was such an act of faith for me. And it probably took most of the pandemic lockdowns for me to say yes to this, Lord, on okay. And it turned out about 80% of what I was doing, I just laid down. 80% of my income, I laid down. My clientele, I laid down and said, Lord, it's yours. And just began a process of disentangling myself from all of those things to do this new unknown thing for me. Yeah.
Mm. Wow. Just to hear that clearly, that this is what you need to give up to do the next thing I have. So from a practical standpoint, because, those are the questions that a listener might be wondering, is how did you go about that? Once you heard that clarity, like, what are some of the things that really were like Did you make a list? What happened?
It's such a great question. And looking back, 2020 hindsight, for those of you who may be at this point, is what I realized is I really wanted to know the how. At the same time, God was telling me the what, and it
Mm,
delayed my surrender by quite a bit because I didn't see how I was going to let go of those clients, of my marketing momentum program that I'd done so successfully for so long and had people enrolled in, etc. And it really brought me to the point where the Lord was saying, no, I don't worry about how. Are you a yes or no? um, and so once I came to that yes, it was interesting, the greater peace I could bring to those conversations with the Lord about the how. The how did not reveal itself in advance. And this has been an important spiritual life lesson for me to realize that no, that's why it's called an act of faith. Because it's not an active sight.
yes.
Hello.
Yeah.
And so just saying yes to the Lord just kind of took the pressure off my shoulders. And it's like, I wonder how we're going to do this, Lord. And so again, in faith, just trying to honor my commitments, give people notice, let them know way in advance, Lord, I want to honor my clients. I want to honor the people in my program. I want to honor the value that this program brings to the world. I don't want to just drop it. I mean, I felt like God had created something beautiful with it, and I felt like he was calling me to lay it down. And so it was probably a period of 12, actually 18 months. Some commitments are still, programs are still active online that people can access, as I slowly phased myself out of it, but said, you have the privilege, of continuing to use this material for as long as you want. And so, yeah, it was a walk of faith, and it was good. It's been
Mm.
really, really good.
Wow, such great takeaways and awareness there of, and I had a kind of sideline seat back then watching this happen as we were working together at Professional Christian Coaching Institute and just knew each other as friends and coaches, of just watching you kind of untangle
Mm-hmm.
all of those things. And I think it's really important to say, for people to hear that timeline, if you're listening, of like, when God gives you a what, there may not be the how until we really commit to the what. And then it's going to take some time to untangle well. Not that it was all tangled in a knot, but I watched you very methodically say, I'm going to let this go, and then this go, and then this go. And then, and you've always been a great communicator in your emails and all of that. But just, um, I, as a participant in that process, having done some of your things, felt very loved and cared for along the way. And if you are a coach or a spiritual director, or you're serving others and you're listening and you're like, I feel something shifting in me that's different. I and my personality and past behaviors have had the tendency to drop and run
Yeah, me too.
and just go, okay, I'm done. Like, and just seeing you love people well, even though it probably took longer
Mhm. Yeah.
than you would have wanted to stay in the game, right? Because once sometimes we decide that something's shifting, we're like, how fast can I get on to the new thing?
Amen. That is so the temptation, right?
It
And
is.
yeah.
And you did it so well. I just really, I don't know, probably never shared that with you before, but just observing and watching that, it's that question we often hear of, how do I finish well?
Mhm.
And yet, once you were finished, once you had those wrapped up, what was beginning to open up in you that you felt like, this is something new? God has got something for me in this being space. It's not a both and. So
Right.
what was that was stirring in you?
Yeah. And there's so much, again, hopefully this is comforting to people and not scary for people. There's so much clarity that still isn't here. So this all started in 2020, and it's been a walk of faith. that God is calling me towards something new. And it's been very step by step, which isn't my favorite way of God's working. I often jokingly think about it, Teresa, in two ways. There's the Noah plan. Okay, there's going to be rain. You need to build an ark. Here's how many nails, how many boards, how many turkeys, how many monkeys. Here's what you're going to do. That's the plan I like. And then there's the Abraham plan. Leave your family and your country, and I'm going to take you to a place you do not know.
Have you been on the Abraham plan?
I've been unfortunately on the Abraham plan for a long time.
And we are recording this in 2024. So remember, Kim said this started in 2020.
But I have felt so loved and cared for by the Lord throughout that time. And some of the things that opened up for me is one, you talked about, Teresa, I think both of our tendencies to be very forward-looking people. I often joke is that I have a windshield and no rear view mirror. I tend to live life in a forward direction. That's neither good nor bad. It's simply my personality.
Right.
And so this has been different for me. But as I was disentangling from those things and God wasn't showing me what's next, because I'm a go-getter. I love to be busy. I love what I do. There was space. And I wasn't used to having space. And it surprised me, saddened me, and then encouraged me. So all of that to say, I didn't realize the toll. These were all good things that I loved, that I really feel like I was doing what God wanted me to do. But nonetheless, the toll it took on my attention and my habits, I had to almost relearn how to read a book. I love to read, but I would find I would read for 5 minutes and think, oh, I should be doing something else. I should be on to the next thing. I would have trouble relaxing because my body was trained to relax in short segments between clients or between programs. And again, I don't think I was doing anything wrong, but I was surprised the physicality and the training and formation that I had been doing in my body and my soul being 100 miles an hour. And the difference, it's slowing down to more like 20 miles an hour because God wasn't really showing me what's next and how much I actually needed that. And I'm glad God almost enforced that on me so that I could bring a much more intentional pace and more thought through decisions, much greater awareness of his still small voice into this next season. So I just want to say there was almost like this weird detox time.
That's what
happened in between.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing you talk about. And I love that you're bringing that up because, as you're following this journey that Kim is sharing with us from her own life of this was where I was, this was my behaviors. And here on the podcast, we've talked about it different times of behaviors, then creating a new routine, right? We have behaviors. Now we've got to go to a routine. Habit might be, then things start to feel like a rhythm. Like, okay, it started to feel, but yeah, I need to get up and go do something else besides that. And then eventually over time, I think those rhythms can actually become spiritual rhythms.
Yeah.
So then the everyday, ordinary life, and you and I love, like, I think that's something we so align on is, how can we notice the moments of life? But when we've gone hair on fire, as I like to say, and he was inviting you so much to the being for your own self first.
Yes. Yeah.
And detoxing you from the doing. Gosh, that's such hard work. I'm just going to say, such hard work. Yeah. Daily work.
Right. And just like you said, though, it's training, right? Training to live a new and different way. And no matter what my outward pace, and I know you believe this deeply, Teresa, I believe my inward spirit can be at rest and be relaxed. But there's a time when there's just seasons when you're finishing a college degree, when you have a new baby, when you're growing a business. There are legitimate seasons when your body's moving a little bit faster than your spirit can keep up with for a sustainable period of time. And so it's good to almost dial back too much, I think, then to let those two things come back in a really integrated manner,
Mhm.
our body and our spirit and our soul and our mind. And that's the difficult gift that
Mhm.
God gave me, simply because I don't think I realized how much I needed it before
Yeah.
he started kind of dialing into new things.
Yeah. I hear you coming in this season to a place of more congruency.
Mhm.
So when I talk about rest, I often say it's internal. Rest is internal in us, but it can all of a sudden get out of whack. And then we go back in, right, to that internal congruency piece. When these things align, relationships and intentional slowing and the energy and the time, when they all align, then I can come back out again. And you were kind of in that middle there for a while of like learning to practice a new way.
Yeah.
So after that season, kind of getting into a new rhythm, taking it a little bit deeper, what started to emerge from this space that he kind of provided you?
Yeah, such an awareness of how uh, hurt and hurried and hustling our culture is, and entrepreneurs and coaches and ministry leaders. Entrepreneurs are twice as likely to suffer from depression as the general
Mm.
population. Twice as likely. 90% of pastors say they feel fatigued and worn out every single week, right? 77% of American employees reported at least one incident of burnout in 2021. So we're just talking, this is the pandemic of spirit that
Mhm.
is around us all the time, and we don't notice it because we're all moving in the same direction and going at the same pace. And the Lord has given me such a heart and a desire to speak directly into that. So before, of course, it was always a part of you're building a business, and I'm a life coach, right? It involves your whole life. It's not just your business. It's a whole thing. But it's almost like, Kim, just go ahead and feel permission to almost remove the primary or secondary, whatever conversations on top of the iceberg, and just work with people who are saying, I just want to sit in the space below the iceberg. I'll work on
Mhm.
my business building with someone else. I'll work on my relationships with someone else. I really realize that the main thing in my life, which is Jesus, I want to spend just an inordinate amount of time paying attention to him, listening to him, responding to him. And as John Mark Comer says, all formation, Christian formation, right, is counter formation. I want to I want to fight against the way the world is for me in very intentional, specific, gentle, invitational ways.
Mm. Yeah. The counterculture in some ways of what we're seeing and hearing. So I'm going to pause for just a minute, because when that becomes the thing, what I don't know if the question I want to ask is, what was the fear or what scared you when that became the, oh, this is the yes. This is what really, like, what was going on for you when you really felt that? Because you had been doing a lot of the marketing. I'm going to help you grow and build, and you were so impactful to so many coaches over the years, taught courses about it, did all the things.
All the things.
And now God is really saying, like, when you hear that call,
Yeah.
like, what was going on? What was the
There's
inner battle?
there there's fears, some fears. There's certainly, it's almost like starting again. It's,
Mm.
like being an accountant and saying, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer. Well, you may know some of the same people, and some people you helped in accounting may need help from a lawyer, but as a rule, it probably not. It's just very different things. And I love the population God's always given me to work with, the people, the coaches, the entrepreneurs, the ministry leaders. I mean, these are my people. But just again, always wanting to love them well. I sent out an email somewhere in there while it was all getting disentangled and, kind of selling marketing momentum for the last time and doing all of those things, where I knew I was going to have to take, the number of people who followed me on email, who entrusted me with their email addresses. and the people who had trusted me on social media to follow me and basically say, I'm at a crossroad and I'm going in a pretty different direction. I'm the same person, but the things I'm talking about are very different. I'm going in a pretty different direction. And I just want to give you full permission to turn the blinker and turn left while I go right and wish you Godspeed. But in doing that, it's like, I've spent 15 years building these relationships, earning this trust, having this conversation, hanging out with these people. Lord, I really don't want them to go away, but I know I need to give them permission to be released to do whatever it is that God's calling them to do. And so I think my biggest fear was that I was going to be hosting a different party in a different room, a lot smaller room, a lot quieter party, and that nobody would come. And so, of course, that's always the fear, isn't it? When we offer anything that we really, really care about, that's important to us. Like, what if I show my newborn baby to the world that I've labored really hard on and everybody thinks she's ugly? That would be sad.
Oh, thank you for that honesty, because I think and I'm just going to say it, I said it before we started, when many people that may listen to this podcast may know you well and they've watched your journey and they've seen where you're at, but for you to say, I have those same fears and I was starting over and hoping people would show up to my party, in a weird way, I don't know why it is, but it's also encouraging. Because as I work with coaches in helping them build their businesses and do things, that's the fear. What if nobody comes? What if nobody wants to be in the same party, that I want to be in? And you were right there as well, in some ways, starting over, following God's call to where he was leading. And yet there's another turn to the story in that all this happens, you make the turn, all the things, and for years, you have hosted with Chris McCluskey over at Professional Christian Coaching Today podcast. I think I said it right. Yeah. I don't know. I'm so used to listening to it. I'm like, did I get the title? And some things shifted there that opened some different doors as Chris walked through some illness and you backed down on the podcast. And maybe that had or didn't have an impact. But as you built this new community, where I want to get to is God opened kind of another space that said, hey, Kim, I got something else I might want for you to do.
And I don't know if he opened a space or once again, he's just kind of dragging me with my heels behind me, because it's please don't ever say this, you guys. I will never. It was such an internal, I will never start my own podcast. I cannot stand just talking to myself in an empty room. I know how hard podcasting is. I know how much I see new people starting podcasts now, and I just want to send them a sympathy card. This is going to be quite a journey, my friend. I've just been there for 10 years and I'm just saying, yikes.
It's like when you don't ever want to say, when you said that, it's like, as a parent, before you have kids, you never want to say, well, I'll never do that with my kids.
That was that moment.
And in business, you never want to say, well, when I get to that point in my business, I'll never.
Yeah.
And but God had a different plan. And last summer was quite a journey.
Right at the beginning of the year, shifted. Absolutely right. This was noted where on the radar screen. And for those of you who don't know, I ended up starting a podcast and it launched in October called The Pace of Grace. But at the beginning of the year, it wasn't the yearly goals, the plan, it was nowhere to be seen. We were just bumping along, doing my spiritual formation training and, all those kinds of things. And I realized again, right, if all Christian formation is counter formation and we're all being formed all the time, thankfully God did send a few people to my party. So I was having conversations with people and in groups and hosting things like that. And it just struck me that we all need training. I mean, almost like going back as toddlers, not that we're dumb, but it's like, we as believers do life entirely differently than this crazy hustle and grind culture and world. And we need information on how do I spend my time? How do I trust the Lord when this happens? How do I practice the presence of God in the middle of a crazy busy day? What do I do when I feel like God's not answering my prayers, but I have to keep moving forward and I don't know what to do, which is on and on the questions. And so he really did just lay it on my heart to have mercifully a short form podcast, so 15 minutes or less, because we are all busy, right? But just taking like one small idea and one topic so that we'd have time to just implement it, just hold on to this one kind of formation idea and just experiment with it for a week and say, what would happen if? How can I walk this out this way? And so the Pace of Grace podcast was formed. Yes, much to my surprise.
It was. So not only does Kim still co-host with Chris McCluskey, our dear friend, over in Professional Christian Coaching Institute, that podcast, Professional Christian Coaching Day. We'll put the link in the show notes. She's still there. They're still doing that podcast once a month. But now she has a new podcast, Pace of Grace. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is all the things of just giving you something intentional that week to hold on to, that's small, that's bite size. One of the best ways that I believe we learn spiritual practices, formation is such a big word, but it comes from the root word of form, right? So we're forming is in small practices.
Yes.
And so the Pace of Grace podcast, I mean, I've been waiting for a long time to have this conversation with Kim, because I want you as a listener to go listen to another podcast, as well as the one you're listening to now. But it is just such great little bite-sized nuggets of, I could do that this week. And then building on another nugget and another nugget. And so the beauty, I love the short format. I think it's very appropriate for even those that are busy, even though I don't love that word, but are busy and searching and seeking for something short, easy to implement, very practical. And you share such beautiful stories from your own real life as you're still figuring that out, just like we all are. But let me ask you this. When you think about the podcast and the title of Pace of Grace, and I know you pondered and prayed and sought God's guidance even on that title, where does that come from?
I realized that most of my life, and that's the beauty of this podcast, is I will always have stories of how I did it wrong. I mean, I have an endless supply of, here's how I did it
Sign
wrong.
me
And
up.
here's what I learned. It's just there's an endless supply. But I think most of our life, and you see this in scripture, are people running ahead of God or lagging behind God, that walk in 2020, Lord, I don't want to give it up. It just feels too hard. Or those times where I've rushed ahead of God. Oh, you gave me a vision, so I'm going to start it tomorrow. I'm going to dive right in. What is the pace of grace? There is always, God is able, right? 2 Corinthians 9:8, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. There's so many superlatives in that one verse. I just can't even stand it. And when I think of that, I think, but where's the grace, right? It's when I'm walking with him. Sometimes he speeds up, sometimes he sits down. But when I'm walking with him, there's always an abundance of grace. And that I want to learn that pacing with him. That's the goal of the next 15 years of my professional journey, is just to walk hand in hand. I'm going to cry. It says keep in step with the Spirit, right? To always just learn to keep in step with him and know that there is sufficient peace and grace and wisdom and just all the things we want.
So beautiful, friend. And as I've listened to these episodes and, put it in the player and it's always there. I know, the day that it comes out and all of those things, it is just this little nugget. But I think for me, and that Romans 12:1-2, which is my life verse of take your everyday, ordinary life, the Message version, and place it before God and as an offering. You're eating, sleeping, everyday, ordinary life. So what I love is that we see bite size into Kim Avery's world. And what, as you said, I always have stories.
Always stories of how I did it
I
wrong.
mean, those are the podcasts I love the most, is when the host lets me see inside their real life. And I was just looking back over titles that you've done. You did a podcast recently about our dear friend Dan Miller and just lessons that you had learned. When God writes your story, sacred, ordinary, God in the messy and the mundane, seasons of abiding in winter, letting go or letting God lead. Great titles, by the way. I just have to say, like, they just draw you in to say, I want to know this little nugget for today of how I can join Kim and God in the pace of grace. And you're just leading us there. So kudos, friend. It is just beautiful work. And I know it's God led. I know it's spirit led. And I love what you just said about this is the next season of my life and where I am. So with that being said, that is the question. Is there a next? Is there more? Or where are you sitting now that you're to this place with this beautiful community?
Mhm.
Pace of Grace podcast. Is there anything you're hearing from God that's next in all of this?
I don't know if it's next. The phrases he's given me for this season are to go deep,
Mm,
start small, and pray big. And so the go deep is just, I want to continue having conversations with individuals in soul care coaching or spiritual direction in groups. I love deep conversations, as I know you do. To not be afraid of starting small and just pray, Lord, you do with it whatever. And so I'm just going to, it's pretty step by step for me right now. I'm just going to, yeah, go deep with people, start small each step as he shows me, and then trust God. And
mm,
big is so relative, right? If it impacts one life, it's fine. Just
yes.
whatever his definition of big, not
Yes.
the world's definition. Just trust that, yeah, I'll be faithful. That's the goal.
Mm,
Faithfulness leads to fruitfulness, right?
right. Oh, what beautiful. Yeah. Write that down. Those three things. What a beautiful mission
Yeah.
statement for this next season. So we will have in the show notes, Pace of Grace, the link. As Kim and I was like, what do we want to share? And she's like, one thing, like, this is it. And it is. Connect there. You'll find all the other ways. Just listen to the podcast, all the other ways that you might be able to connect with Kim and the beautiful work that she is doing. We kind of glossed over just a little bit, but you've actually, in the last few years, as a lifelong learner that you are, have gone and done spiritual direction training and invested in that. And I know, as that kind of wrapped up, are you to the end of that? Or are we still journeying there?
I wrote my final paper
Oh,
today. I haven't turned it in yet, so y'all can pray for me depending when this airs. We'll either be
yeah.
celebrating or mourning, but I wrote my final paper
That is
today. Yeah,
beautiful. Congratulations.
thank you.
I've done that journey as well. In fact, kind of the opposite of Kim. I did spiritual direction first and realized my wiring, at least in that season, I don't know, I'm still in kind of both foot camps or whatever, that I did have more of a coach approach to how I showed up with people. And I think that's the beauty of serving people well and following God's leading is none is wrong. They're just different in how we are, but both can be blessed and used by God. So congratulations on the
Yeah.
final,
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I'll
final
let you
part
know
of
if
that
we
journey.
celebrate. Yeah.
We'll come back for part two on that one. But no, that'll be beautiful. And yeah, that's wonderful. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me just for a great conversation and I hope as you're listening in, you do hear Kim's journey, just like many of us, to where is God calling and how is he leading? And am I giving space to listen? Am I giving space to listen? So, Kim, thank you so much for joining me. How
Oh,
much fun.
thank you. And can I just say real quick, thank you for the beautiful work you do in the world.
Oh,
I'm
thank
so
you.
thankful, and your listeners are so blessed to have you. So I appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you. Likewise. Such a great conversation with my friend Kim Avery. Just so grateful for her in my life. And I want to invite her into your life. So listen to that Pace of Grace podcast. Go out and find it. It's a great inspiration each and every week that Kim is bringing to you, and you're going to love it. And I also suggest you go out to One Life Maps and get that very first map, that My Life Now map. It'll be a great tool for you to just discern some of these things for yourself and see what is the lingering question that God has for you right now in this season. So thank you, my friend, for giving me your time, for listening in to this conversation and this episode. I invite you back next week to the Doing What Matters podcast. I'll see you then. And remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. Have a great week, friend.